Have you ever sat down in a chair, just a chair, but someone's gaze made it seem like you didn't belong there? No shouting, no pushing, just a soft voice was enough to send chills down your spine. This isn't for you. Imagine this. If it happened in front of dozens of eyes, in front of phones, secretly recording, and in front of a society always ready to judge. What would you do? Silently walk away, or stand up, but in a way that makes the whole world reconsider. Today, I want to tell you the story of Dr. Naomi Ellington, a black woman who boarded a regular flight, and just 10 minutes later she held the entire crew on that plane accountable for the insult they had inflicted. This story isn't meant to provoke anger, but rather to encourage self-reflection. If you believe that every human being deserves respect, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can embark on this special journey together. That morning at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport began like any other clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the parking lot still held the lingering chill of the previous night. People dragged their suitcases, grabbed their coffee, and occasionally stopped to check messages or look at the electronic display board to see if the gates were open. None of them knew that in just a few minutes, right at an ordinary boarding gate, a story would emerge and spread across America as a powerful reminder of human dignity. Amidst the bustling crowds, Dr. Naomi Ellington walked slowly toward gate C-18. She wore a long, charcoal-colored coat, a simple yet sophisticated style. No logos, no flashy branding. Everything was understated, just like her. She is the CEO of Ellington Aviation Group, one of the fastest-growing private airlines of the decade. A black woman in an industry dominated by established corporations and white-haired CEOs. That achievement was no easy feat, and anyone familiar with the industry knows how many doors slammed shut in her face. But today, Naomi just wanted a peaceful flight to New York, JFK. An important meeting awaited her there. She had been preparing her presentation for months, and this trip for her was like the final step before a deal that could change the future of thousands of SkyJet employees. However, she had no idea that before she could utter a single word in the meeting room, she would face another test. A test not on the schedule, but one that would shape everything that followed. Naomi glanced around the airport as if capturing every moment of everyday life. A child was holding her mother's hand. An elderly man was adjusting his cane. Two young flight attendants were smiling at each other as they walked past. She sighed softly. Despite her success deep down, she still harbored fragments of the past times she'd been stopped by security at the entrance of a luxurious building simply because she didn't look like she was there for a meeting. Times she'd been mistaken for her own secretary's assistant. Times she'd had to prove herself twice, even 3 times, because of her appearance. Those things had become a habit, an invisible cloak she wore every day, composure. Not because she didn't hurt, but because she had learned to move past it. She glanced at the wall clock. There were about 25 minutes left until boarding. Naomi took out her phone and reopened the email from SkyJet's legal department, the airline with which Ellington Aviation was preparing to sign a restructuring agreement. The document was over 200 pages long, but she knew every sentence and every number by heart. Part of her business strategy is thorough preparation. The phone vibrated gently. A message from the assistant. "Your flight hasn't changed. It's sunny in New York right now. Have a pleasant flight." Naomi smiled. It was simple. A normal day, a normal flight. Or at least that's what she thought. As the airport loudspeaker announced that first-class passengers were beginning to board, Naomi took a deep breath. She gently adjusted the strap of her leather handbag, a gift from her mother many years ago. To her, it served as a reminder of her journey from a poor girl in South Chicago to where she stood today. She walked towards the airplane door. The carpet was a deep blue. She could hear the flight attendants laughing and chatting. The smell of coffee mingled with the familiar scent of the cabin's air conditioning. Naomi didn't know that in just a few minutes, a flight attendant's hand would come down on her wrist, and the entire little world inside this airplane would hold its breath. But that moment hasn't arrived yet. Right now, it's just the calm before the storm, and that storm is waiting right behind the door. The airplane door opened with a familiar soft and steady click, like the weary sigh of a tired morning. Naomi stepped onto the dark green carpet leading into the first-class cabin, her hand still lightly gripping the strap of her bag. She was familiar with this space. The spacious seats, the warm yellow lighting, the scent of coffee mingling with the fresh plastic of the cabin. It all evoked a sense of security during her frequent business trips. But that morning, the moment Naomi stepped one foot onto the platform, a flight attendant's voice rang out, cold and harsh, cutting the space in two. "Ma'am, stop right there." Naomi paused, slightly surprised but maintaining her composure. Standing before her was Madison Cole, the flight attendant, tall with neatly tied-up hair and the cold, sharp eyes of someone accustomed to wielding power. Madison glanced quickly at Naomi's casual attire, then looked down at the ticket in her hand, but not with a professional gaze, but with suspicion mixed with a barely concealed hint of contempt. She said softly, but with a sharp edge, "This is the first-class cabin. Are you sure you haven't come to the wrong place?" Naomi's heart skipped a beat. That phrase, it sounded so familiar. Not because it was malicious, but because she had heard it so many times in her life, each time in a different version. Naomi smiled, trying to remain polite. "I'm not mistaken. I'm flying first class." She handed the boarding pass toward Madison, but what happened next made the entire space seem to shrink. Madison didn't handle the ticket professionally. She snatched it from Naomi's hand so forcefully that the paper scraped against her wrist, stinging. And then, which brought the entire cabin to a breathless silence, Madison slapped Naomi hard on the wrist as if Naomi had deliberately overstepped her boundaries or done something wrong. "Don't try that with me." Madison's voice was so cold it could scratch your skin. "First place isn't a charity program. Please go back to your area." The atmosphere froze. Passengers in the cabin turned their heads. A few frowned slightly, but not out of pity for Naomi, but because they thought she was causing trouble. Naomi took a deep breath. She could feel the skin on her wrist turning red. She could feel the scrutinizing gazes of strangers. She could feel the whispers beginning to spread like ripples. That moment was very quiet. Quiet like when you hear your heart beating unusually fast in a crowded room. From a nearby seat, an elderly woman whispered to her husband without trying to hide it, "I've seen this before. They always try to sneak in." A businessman in seat 1C shrugged in exasperation. Another one. Then he took out his phone as if this were an opportunity to record something interesting. Naomi stood there, neither bowing her head nor reacting strongly. Her composure was not feigned. It came from long years of having to defend herself without being allowed to lose her temper. She spoke slowly and clearly so that no one could misunderstand. "I have a first-class ticket, and I have the right to sit in the seat I purchased." Madison smirked. That smile held no trace of professionalism. It contained the smug satisfaction of someone who believed they were in a superior position. "Sure, let me check for you." She held the ticket up to the cabin light, tilting it back and forth as if examining a cheap item. Then, in front of everyone, Madison slammed the ticket against Naomi's chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough for everyone to hear. Enough for the man live streaming to move the camera closer. Enough for a few people to smile with satisfaction, as if they had just witnessed a proper lesson. Naomi felt a warmth in her chest. Not from pain, but from the familiar feeling of humiliation. She wasn't angry. She had learned not to let anyone control her emotions. But deep inside, a small wound resurfaced. A wound from a childhood memory when she was chased out of the library by a security guard simply because he thought she had gone to the wrong section. Madison tilted her head. "Ma'am, please move to coach. Now." Those words echoed in Naomi's head like a hammer pounding on a table. She looked directly into Madison's eyes. Not challenging, not angry, just a calm gaze. "I'll sit in my seat." That moment was like a pause in the music. The atmosphere became still, waiting to see what would happen. Madison laughed, then turned to her colleague. "We've got one refusing to move. Security will love this." Then she placed her hand on the walkie-talkie and spoke clearly. "Call security to gate C-18. A passenger is not complying with regulations." Some passengers started taking out their phones to film. Others were visibly annoyed by the trouble. And in row 2, a man named Ethan Parker started live streaming. The camera angle was on Naomi. Viewer count increased. The first early comments appeared. "Another fraud. Kick her out. They always make trouble." Naomi heard everything, but she didn't let them see her pain. She spoke only softly like a whisper. "I'm not causing trouble. I just want to be respected." It wasn't a plea. It was the affirmation of someone who had come a long way and would no longer accept being held back by the prejudices of others. Meanwhile, somewhere at the back of the compartment, a young woman placed her hand on her chest and whispered, "Why does this feel so wrong?" That moment of silence lasted as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for what would happened next? Then, heavy footsteps echoed from the airplane door. The blue uniforms of security personnel appeared. The leader was Officer Samuel Boyd. His face was serious. He had no idea that he was about to become the subject of a story that would spread across America. Madison immediately pointed at Naomi. "That's her. She's refusing to move." Officer Boyd approached, his voice even and formal. "Ma'am, we need your cooperation." And at that very moment, the silence within Naomi transformed into a very clear stream of thought. She wasn't just fighting for a seat. She was standing for all the times she had been humiliated without being able to fight back. Standing for those who would board the flight tomorrow and also be judged by the color of their skin, their clothing, or the gaze of someone who felt entitled to judge them. Naomi looked at Officer Boyd, then said slowly, "I will cooperate. But before that, I want to meet the captain." The airplane cabin was turbulent. Madison retorted immediately, almost shouting, "Captain doesn't have time for this." Naomi replied, just as gently as she had begun. "If everything is resolved properly, then he will want to hear the truth." A simple statement, but it's like a stone dropped into a calm lake, and from that moment the flight ceased to be a flight. It became a stage. And Naomi, against her will, was standing right in the center of it. Officer Samuel Boyd's footsteps echoed through the cabin like drum beats, signaling something about to spiral out of control. Naomi stood still, back straight, hands clasped in front of her stomach as if protecting her own peace. No one in the cabin spoke. A few people took out their phones, but they were more cautious because in Naomi's eyes there was a calmness many hadn't expected. Officer Boyd stopped in front of her, his breathing steady, but his eyes sharp with the wariness of someone accustomed to dealing with troublemakers. He glanced at Naomi briefly, then turned to Madison as if to confirm the situation. Madison crossed her arms, her voice sharp and biting. "This passenger refuses to move to coach. She's blocking the boarding process." Naomi didn't rush to react. She could clearly feel her heartbeat slow but deep. Sometimes silence is the greatest strength. Officer Boyd asked, "Ma'am, is that correct?" Naomi looked up, her eyes, showing no defiance, just genuine sincerity. "I'm not refusing to cooperate. I just want to sit in the seat I bought. And before anyone forces me off the plane, I want to see the captain." A soft hiss escaped from the back seat, as if someone had just witnessed something unbelievable. A young woman whispered, "She's brave." But on the other side, jeers also arose. Why can't she just follow instructions, always trying to play victim? The atmosphere became heavy. The kind of heaviness you get in a room when people disagree, but no one has the courage to say what's right. Madison crossed her arms across her chest, her voice irritated. "Captain doesn't have time for this. We're going to be late." Naomi looked her straight in the eyes. If it were a minor issue, it wouldn't have escalated to this point. That statement brought the entire cabin to a moment of breathless silence. It wasn't loud, it wasn't offensive, but it resonated deeply like a knife cutting right at the heart of the matter. In seat 1C, Ethan Parker, the man live streaming, moved the camera closer. He whispered into the camera, "This is getting crazy. She really thinks she deserves first-class." Comments began to flood the screen, kick her off. "She's lying." Another entitled passenger. Other comments were more cautious. "Why is the flight attendant being so rude? Just check her ticket properly." But the truth is, most viewers knew nothing about Naomi. They just saw a black woman standing in the middle of first class and a group of airline staff trying to force her off the plane. In situations like these, people often choose to believe the easier-to-swallow version that she is the problem. Not the system, not the discrimination, just her. Darren Holt, the flight manager, walked over with a weary expression, the kind of expression of someone who thinks it's all a minor issue, just an unreasonable passenger. He spoke quickly, his voice impatient. "Ma'am, we need to stick to the schedule. If you don't get into your seat, we'll have to ask you to leave the plane." No exceptions. Naomi turned to look at Darren. She didn't know him. He didn't know her either. But his eyes, full of prejudice and blind confidence, reminded her of an old memory. Years ago, that same gaze fell upon her when she applied for a scholarship. The gaze of a teacher who didn't believe she could do it, because people like her usually don't make it in this field. Naomi blinked slightly, pushing the memory aside. "I don't want to leave the plane, but I want this matter to be resolved properly." Darren chuckled sarcastically. "The correct way is to follow our instructions." Naomi didn't answer. Instead, she opened her handbag and took out her small wallet, deliberately, slowly, as if deflating layers of tense air. She handed the boarding pass to Darren. He glanced over, but not to read, just to show that he didn't need any more information. Fake tickets look real all the time. An ta hun vai. We can't take any risks. An angry sigh escaped from seat 2D, and a middle-aged black man stood up slightly before saying, "I saw her ticket when she came in. It said, first class." Darren turned around, his voice sharp. "Sir, please sit down or you'll be removed as well." The atmosphere was torn apart. No one spoke softly anymore. All eyes were on Naomi, Officer Boyd, Madison, and Darren. At that moment, Naomi felt a pang in her heart, not because she was afraid, but because she saw her younger self. This woman from years ago would probably have remained silent and left to avoid trouble to prevent things from getting worse. But the Naomi of today is different. She has come too far to bow her head in a moment like this. She spoke slowly, clearly, her voice not high but with weight. "If you believe I don't have a valid ticket, please invite the captain to come and check. I will accept his conclusion." Madison waved her hand. "Captain is busy. He won't be coming." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "If that's his decision, I'll respect it. Otherwise, I think he wants to know what's going on in his compartment." The words weren't threatening, but they carried a certain quality that made Officer Boyd pause slightly. He looked at Naomi for another second as if he were beginning to realize that things might not be as simple as Madison described. Darren was starting to lose patience. He turned to Officer Boyd. "Escort her off. We're running late." But Boyd didn't rush to act. He looked at Naomi again, then asked, "Ma'am, could you show me your ID?" Naomi nodded. She took out her purse and placed it in his hand. Not harsh, not demanding, just a simple gesture. Boyd glanced at her card and paused for a few seconds, his eyebrows slightly raised. He didn't tell anyone else to see it, but Naomi noticed. That look, the kind that says, "I'm not sure about this." It was the first sign of a small crack in the wall of prejudice that surrounded her. But Madison quickly interjected, "ID doesn't matter if the seat isn't hers." Darren nodded vigorously. "We have procedures. Remove her." And that's the moment when the string is stretched to the point where it seems about to snap. Then the cabin loudspeaker blared. "Flight attendants pause all departure preparations. Captain Reynolds is approaching the cabin." Everyone in the cabin held their breath. Madison turned pale. Darren turned his head, slightly flustered. The man live streaming suddenly lowered his phone as if unsure whether to be happy or worried. And Naomi. She let out a soft sigh, the first since entering the cabin. It wasn't because she won. It was because she knew the truth was about to come to light, no matter how unpleasant it might be. The cockpit door swung open. Captain Thomas Reynolds stepped inside, his steps firm but serious. He surveyed the cabin, and when his gaze settled on Naomi, he stopped dead in his tracks. 1 second, then 2 seconds. In that small cabin, the silence was so profound that you could clearly hear someone swallow. Captain Reynolds approached Naomi. His face was slightly pale. His voice was low but firm. "Everyone, step away from seat 1A. The entire compartment exploded in a panic. Madison Captain She Reynolds raised his hand to stop them, his eyes never leaving Naomi. Not another word. At that moment, no one knew what was happening. No one understood why Captain looked at Naomi with such a heavy gaze, a mixture of respect and worry. But everyone knows one thing for sure. The order of power has just changed, and what follows will shape the entire flight and the lives of everyone on board. The entire cabin seemed to freeze the moment Captain Thomas Reynolds walked in and looked at Naomi with an expression unlike that of an ordinary passenger. No one could explain the feeling in words, but everyone sensed it clearly. Something much bigger was brewing beneath the surface of this story. Naomi remained still, her face calm. But behind that calmness, her heart tightened slightly, not from fear, but because memories of years of being misjudged were quietly resurfacing. Those memories were like echoes from the past, reminding her that she had once been small, once looked down upon, once forced to leave a room simply because she didn't belong there. But today, she is no longer that young woman. Captain Reynolds stood before Naomi for a second longer than social courtesy would suggest. He took a deep breath, then turned to Officer Boyd. "Stand down for now. No removal." Madison's eyes widened. "Captain." She refused to. Reynolds turned around, his voice not loud, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Cole, please hold your comments." This was the first time Madison had been silent. And it was also the first time everyone in the cabin realized that real tension was beginning to build. Naomi slowly sat down in seat 1A. She said nothing, no argument, no attempt to prove herself. Her silence sparked more curiosity than a dozen explanations. Meanwhile, something small but important happened, something that very few people noticed. Naomi opened her handbag and took out her phone. But instead of making a call or recording a video, she opened an internal application. The application's interface was minimalist, with only 3 small icons. She lightly pressed one icon like pressing a secret door. 3 messages were sent in less than 3 seconds. The screen flickered. General Counsel Private Line, Ellington Board Chair, Secure Ops Command Channel Priority Alert. A young woman in seat 3B, who had been silent from the beginning, inadvertently saw the words. Her eyes widened, as if trying to make sure she wasn't mistaken. She let out a very soft sigh. Oh my God, no one else heard. But the man sitting next to her, a black man in his late 42s, noticed the change in her eyes. He asked softly, "What did you see?" The girl swallowed hard. I think she is someone important," but she didn't elaborate. Perhaps it was because she herself didn't fully believe what she had just read. Meanwhile, Ethan Parker's live stream was still running. Over 600 people were watching live, but the chat box started to change its tone. Some comments read, "Why is the captain acting like that? Something's off. He looks scared. Maybe the woman isn't who we think." Those watching gradually realized it wasn't Naomi who was causing the tension. It was Madison who had judged her with just one glance. And from here, the viewer's perspective begins to shift. Darren Holt, the flight manager, approached, trying to appear calm, but his voice trembled slightly. "Captain, we're running late. Gate is urging us on." Reynolds looked directly at Darren, his eyes heavy with a sense of responsibility. "We may be dealing with a serious misjudgment here." Darren frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, she refused to follow instructions. She's causing the delay." Reynolds shook his head. "You don't know who she is." That statement was like a silent bomb exploding inside the cabin. No one fully understood its meaning, but everyone felt the immediate shift in energy. Naomi remained seated. She said nothing. She didn't look at anyone. She simply placed the phone gently on the tray as if everything was under control. But actually, inside her mind was racing with many thoughts. She felt partly hurt because she had to go through once again what she had tried to believe society had become better. Partially exhausted because she was on her way to an important meeting, and now she was being insulted in what should have been a safe space. But also partly stronger because she realized this was a moment when people like her couldn't remain silent. She recalled her mother's words, "Naomi, you can't change how people see you, but you can change how you stand firm in front of them." Her breathing softened, and then she made a decision. Madison remained standing, hands on her hips, refusing to back down. She said to Reynolds, "Captain, with all due respect, she's wasting everyone's time." Naomi lifted her head, her eyes deep but calm. "It wasn't me. You're the one who took things further than necessary." Darren retorted, "Ma'am, you have no right." Naomi placed her hand on the tray in front of her gently, but the sound was enough to make everyone stop. She said, "I have all the rights, just like any other passenger who has purchased a valid ticket." At that moment, Madison felt her wall of confidence begin to crumble. Naomi was nothing like the other troublesome passengers she'd encountered. No yelling, no cursing, no losing her temper. That calmness baffled Madison, as if she were facing someone who didn't fit the stereotype she was used to judging. And then things took a second turn. Darren's phone vibrated violently. He looked at the screen. Then, his face turned pale. A clear message appeared from SkyJet's internal system. "Alert passenger identity verification request received from Ellington Aviation." Darren muttered. "Impossible." Madison leaned in to look at the screen, and her expression instantly changed from confident to confused, then to frightened. "Ellington, isn't that—" Darren swallowed hard, unable to speak. And Naomi, she remained seated, her hand resting on her phone. No boasting, no threats, simply letting the system do its job. But that moment was enough for everyone to understand that this was no longer just about seats. Officer Boyd approached Naomi, this time not in a demanding tone but with respect. "Ma'am, is there anything we need to be aware of?" Naomi looked at him, her gaze warm but firm. "All I need is fairness. The rest, the system will handle." For a moment, Boyd nodded slightly as if he too recognized the truth that was gradually emerging. Captain Reynolds approached, lowering his voice just loud enough for Darren and Madison to hear, but those sitting nearby still caught a few words. If this is really her, we're in serious trouble. Madison ran up, but I didn't know. Reynolds gritted his teeth. You didn't care to know. That statement was like a knife, cutting into an already tense atmosphere. Ethan Parker, who was live streaming, brought the camera closer to himself and whispered, "Guys, something's happening." The vibe in here just flipped. View count increased to 1200, but now the comments are no longer one-sided. Wait, who is she really? Ellington Aviation. That sounds familiar. Oh damn, isn't that the company that owns half the SkyJet fleet? The chat feed was pouring in like a storm. In that moment, Naomi looked out the window. The early morning sunlight shone on her face, soft and golden. A very ordinary moment, but it felt like a gateway into her inner self. She wondered, why do the most heartbreaking moments often come on what seem like the most peaceful days? Why do prejudices cling to her even though she has reached a position many people only dream of? There was a fleeting moment of sadness, a very human moment. But then, her breathing returned to normal. She had gone too far to turn back. The cockpit door opened again. Captain Reynolds stepped out, his face grim. He stood upright, surveyed the entire compartment, and declared, "We will verify everything immediately. And until then, no one touches this passenger." Naomi looked up, and their eyes met for a moment. That moment speaks volumes. The truth cannot be suppressed any longer. And this was just the beginning of a reversal that those on board would never forget. The atmosphere in the cabin suddenly became as thick as the fog before a major storm. Passengers who had been chatting, looking at their phones, or reclining in their seats fell silent. All eyes were fixed on the front where Captain Thomas Reynolds stood in the dim yellow light of the cabin. His face was serious, not the kind of seriousness one has when about to reprimand someone, but the seriousness of someone who has just realized they are standing before a situation that could change their entire career. Naomi looked at him, her gaze as calm as still water, a calmness not of indifference, but of the experience of someone who had lived through too many moments of wrongful judgment. Beside her, Madison stood tall, but her shoulders were slightly hunched. Her eyes glanced at Naomi, sometimes with arrogance, sometimes with fear. Her initial confidence was crumbling little by little. Captain Reynolds took a shallow breath, then spoke in a deep, clear, and unmistakable voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your positions while we review the situation." Although he spoke softly, his voice carried weight, causing the entire cabin to fall silent. There was no more whispering, no more complaining. He turned to Darren and Madison. "I need the full report, right now." Darren stepped up, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "Sir, this passenger has refused to comply with instructions. We asked her to return to her seat in economy class, but she refused to cooperate." Reynolds neither nodded nor shook his head. He only asked one question. "Have you verified your ticket?" Darren paused briefly, just for a few seconds, but enough for everyone to notice. Madison interjected. "Captain, I've checked. But—" "How do you check?" Reynolds interrupted. His voice wasn't harsh, but it was enough to make the listener's heart race. Madison suddenly lost some of its momentum. "I looked at the ticket and felt there was a problem." The silence lasted long enough for the cabin to clearly hear the rustling of someone's pocket. Naomi didn't interrupt. She placed her hands on her thighs, maintaining a steady breath, but her mind raced through everything that was about to happen. She knew this moment was important not just for her, but for all those who had silently endured injustice, believing their voices would go nowhere. Reynolds turned completely to Naomi, a gesture of respect she hadn't asked for. "Ma'am, I'd like to double-check your ticket and ID." Naomi nodded. She handed over her ticket and ID without hesitation. Reynolds took them in his hands. His eyes scanned each detail, a stark contrast to the dismissive attitude Madison had displayed. He paused at her name, Dr. Naomi Ellington, then slowly looked up. A glimmer of realization appeared in his eyes, like someone piecing together two previously thought to be unrelated puzzle pieces. Darren observed Captain's expression and began to feel his heart pounding faster than usual. Madison sensed the change as well. She took a half step back, her hand unconsciously gripping the edge of the chair. Reynolds spoke slowly. "This file is very special." Madison impatiently asked. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Reynolds didn't answer her. He looked over at Officer Boyd. Suspend all enforcement procedures. I need to conduct further checks. Boyd nodded vigorously, as if someone had finally said something he had suspected for a long time. Naomi felt her breath ease slightly, not because she had won, but because finally someone saw her as a human being, not as a mold to be judged. But she remained silent. She knew the truth was yet to be revealed. Reynolds took his work phone from his jacket pocket, stepped back a few paces, and dialed a number. His voice was low, serious, and somewhat anxious. "This is Captain Reynolds, from SkyJet, Flight 382. I urgently need to verify the identity of a passenger, Doctor. Naomi Ellington." Everyone in the cabin held their breath. No one knew exactly what was happening, but that silence, long, deep, and weighty, signaled an impending storm. Reynolds stood with his back to the passengers, but his tense posture and the movement of his shoulders suggested that every response from the other end of the line was shocking him. He replied softly, "Yes, I understand. No, I didn't know she would be on this flight. I checked the ID. I absolutely confirm. I understand the seriousness of this." When he hung up the phone, his expression changed completely. Gone was the tense expression of someone dealing with a crisis. Instead, there was the seriousness of someone aware that even the slightest mistake could have enormous consequences. Darren looked at him and asked anxiously, "Sir, what's wrong?" Reynolds looked at him, his eyes, a mixture of disappointment and warning. "Do you know who Dr. Ellington is?" Darren swallowed hard. I don't know." Reynolds Quay sang Madison. And you, Madison shook her head, no longer showing any trace of self-satisfaction. "No, I don't know." Reynolds exhaled a heavy sigh. "Doctor, Naomi Ellington is the CEO of Ellington Aviation, the company that owns 19 aircraft in SkyJet's fleet. That includes the plane we're standing on right now." The entire cabin exploded amidst a series of hissing sounds. Ethan was speaking as if he had difficulty breathing while live streaming. "Hold up, she owns this plane." Comments poured in. "No way! Madison is done! This is insane! I knew something was off." The woman in seat 3B whispered, "I read the real name correctly." The man next to her shook his head, stunned. "This will be the darkest day for the company." Madison's face turned completely pale. Darren stood frozen like a statue. Naomi just sat still. She knew this moment would come, but when it actually arrived, her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't happy, not gloating, just sad. Sad because in order to be respected, she had to prove who she was. She was saddened that such a reality still existed in society, even though she had tried to believe that things were getting better. Reynolds walked up to Naomi. His face was full of respect. "Dr. Ellington, I'm sorry, deeply sorry." Naomi looked at him, her gaze soft but firm. "Captain, I don't need special privileges. I just need to be treated like a normal passenger." Reynolds bowed his head slightly, a rare gesture in the airplane cabin. And she should have received that from the moment she boarded the plane. Madison ran up, her voice choked. I don't know." Naomi looked at her, not harsh. "No revenge, just the truth. You don't need to know who I am. You just need to know that I'm a human being." At that moment, someone in the back seat who had been silent until now suddenly spoke. "That's the real problem. We only treat people right when we know what they can do." That statement brought the entire cabin to a standstill. A painful truth, but we need to listen. Reynolds straightened up, his voice deep and resolute. "I will handle the entire matter. No one is to touch Dr. Ellington until I have completed my report." Naomi nodded slightly. Her breathing returned to normal. On her phone screen, the 3 messages she had sent earlier had just received replies. A small light flickered. A signal that this story wasn't over yet. In fact, it's only just beginning. Inside SkyJet 382, the atmosphere shifted to a strange energy, silent yet tense, as if everyone were waiting for an invisible door to open. The gazes directed at Naomi were no longer the same as before, no longer filled with suspicion or prejudice. Now they were a mixture of bewilderment, curiosity, and a touch of embarrassment from those who realized they had misjudged her. "Doctor." Naomi Ellington sat calmly in seat 1, her back straight, her hands clasped together on her lap. A strange calmness prevailed in this otherwise chaotic setting. Her phone lay on the desk tray. The screen had just lit up with replies to 3 urgent messages. The text is clearly visible, legal notified. Standing by. Board chair online. Ops command verification in progress. Naomi looked at the words, a hint of sadness in her eyes. Sad because this situation had occurred. Sad because she had become accustomed to activating such protective measures. But then she put the phone down again and let out a soft sigh. She didn't want this to turn into a battle, but she knew the truth needed to be revealed, and sometimes it couldn't be revealed in silence. At the front of the cockpit, Captain Thomas Reynolds maintained a serious expression. His more than 20 years of experience behind the wheel couldn't hide the pressure he felt this time. Opposite him were Madison Cole and Darren Holt, both of whom had lost some of their former confidence. Reynolds said, his voice still low but with a hint of displeasure, both of them did not follow the correct procedure. Zero verification. Darren tried to defend himself. Sir, the situation at that time, Reynolds interrupted, not loudly but sharply as a knife. Do you think your intuition is more accurate than the data? Darren didn't answer. Madison clasped her hands together, her fingernails digging into her skin until they turned white. From Seat 1C, Ethan Parker was still live streaming. The chat box was constantly overflowing with comments. This is wild. They really messed with the wrong person. I feel bad now. I judged her too quick. But what surprised everyone was Naomi's silence. Not a single insult, not a single accusation, just a calmness as if she had understood everything beforehand. A passenger in row 4 whispered. She could have yelled. But she remained strangely calm. An elderly woman nodded. That's what made me realize. She's stronger than we thought. Then, unexpectedly, Captain Reynolds' phone rang. An internal message, top priority 1. He opened it. He read it. And his expression changed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was absolute respect. Reynolds turned to look at Naomi. The cabin lights reflected off her face, making her look as if she were at the center of a story bigger than herself, a story she didn't want to be the protagonist of. Reynolds walked over, slow, steady, like someone preparing to announce a truth that could shake the entire airplane cabin. He stopped in front of Naomi and speak loud enough for everyone to hear. Dr. Ellington. Your identity has been confirmed by Ellington Aviation and SkyJet Corporate. The murmur spread immediately, like waves crashing. Reynolds continued. She's not just the CEO of Ellington Aviation, she's also coordinating aircraft maintenance projects for the entire SkyJet fleet this year. Some people gasped. Some put their hands to their chests. Madison looked as if she could barely stand. Darren whispered, his voice no longer his own. We messed up. We messed up badly. Naomi remained seated. Her eyes held neither pride nor revenge. Just a gentle sadness, very human, very quiet. I tried to say, I had a first-class ticket. Reynolds bowed his head briefly. No one should have doubted that. But this isn't the biggest truth. Naomi's phone vibrated softly. Another message popped up. Ops. Secondary verification complete. Naomi looked at Captain Reynolds. Captain, I think there's one more piece of information. Reynolds nodded, took out his work phone, and read the data that had just been sent. And this time, he stood still for a few seconds. Those moments of silence made the entire cabin seem to hold its breath. Reynolds read slowly. Besides his role as CEO, Dr. Ellington is also a co-investor in the air traffic control system upgrade project we are currently undertaking. A silent explosion. All eyes turned to Naomi, as if they had just seen a completely different picture from the person they had initially judged. Madison took another step back. Darren stood motionless, his hands clasped together as if he wanted to disappear. Ethan turned the camera to himself and whispered, Guys, this isn't a passenger issue anymore. This is a corporate nightmare. The chat window exploded. Oh my God, she literally works with the airline. They racially profiled their own partner. This will go viral everywhere. In that atmosphere, Naomi said something that plunged the cabin into a deep silence. I don't want any of you to be afraid of me. I just want you to listen to me, like any other passenger. That remark made a man in row 2C turn away, feeling uneasy about himself for judging her from the very first moment. Madison's voice trembled. I was wrong. Naomi looked at her, her gaze neither harsh nor reproachful, just truthful. I want to know, what makes you think I can't sit here? Madison couldn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how to name what she had carried within her for so long. A black passenger in row 4 whispered, We all know why. No one objected. Captain Reynolds looked around the cabin. "We will handle this matter seriously." Naomi shook her head slightly. "I don't need to be harsh or lenient. I just want the truth to be told. And I want this not to happen to anyone else." Her voice wasn't loud, but it resonated through the air, touching each person like a drop of water falling onto a lake. Creates wave patterns. Suddenly, Naomi's phone rang again. This time, it was a phone call. The caller's name appears Ellington, board chair. The entire compartment seemed to freeze over. Naomi looked at the screen for a few seconds, then pressed accept. She held the phone to her ear, her voice calm. "Yes, Uncle. I'm fine." Reynolds froze when he heard the words board chair. Madison's face had completely lost all color. Naomi continued, "Things are being resolved. I wanted to record it to deal with later, but no, I don't want anyone to be humiliated." She listened in silence for another sentence from the other end of the line. Then she smiled softly, a calm yet powerful smile, "I know. But we can't change anything if we only react with anger. I want change to come from understanding." When she ended the call, the cabin was silent. It just felt like a woman had opened a door, leading to a part of the truth that others needed to confront. Captain Reynolds approached his voice, low but sincere. "Dr. Ellington, do you want us to continue the flight, or stop here?" All eyes were on Naomi. A long moment passed. Then she said softly but clearly, "I want us to continue, but not with fear, but with respect." She looked around the cabin, for all of us. At that moment, the cabin was as silent as if it were under a glass dome. No one moved, until one person started clapping, then a second, then the whole compartment. The truth has been revealed, and from that moment on, nothing can ever go back to how it was before. The applause in the cabin gradually subsided, but the feeling that spread through everyone's minds remained. Something too big had just been revealed. Not just Naomi's identity, not just the hidden truth, but a broader picture of how people see each other, judge each other, and sometimes hurt each other in just a few short seconds. But in the modern world where every moment can be captured, this story is no longer confined to the airplane. It's spreading, and it's spreading very quickly. In seat 1C, Ethan Parker, the man still live streaming, unconsciously stared at his screen. The numbers in the upper right corner were flashing rapidly like a countdown to a bomb. 1200 live viewers. 1800-2400. Ethan swallowed hard. Okay guys, this is getting way bigger than I thought. The chat window exploded at a speed he couldn't keep up with. This is going viral. Media picking it up. SkyJet is done. Ellington Aviation. Trending has shown. One comment sent shivers down his spine. CNN just tweeted about it. He put the phone down, turned to the person sitting next to him and whispered, "This is beyond my control." In the back seat, a young woman who had initially seen Naomi's name in the app opened her phone. She only intended to check her messages, but when she opened Twitter, the first line left her breathless. Number. SkyJet incident number, Naomi Ellington, number flying while black. All three hashtags are accelerating, like the wind swirling before. A storm hits. She scrolled down and saw the clips, some from Ethan, some from other passengers' cameras, some edited together with shocking captions. What were they doing to a black CEO on the very plane her company owned? A 10-second video, clip showing Madison snatching Naomi's ticket was viewed. Nearly 200,000 times in just a few minutes. The girl whispered, "Oh my God, it's spreading so fast." The man next to her shook his head. "I've seen stories like this before, but never right in front of me." And Naomi, she remained seated, completely unmoved. She understood the implications of this contagion. She understood the fire had started, and even though she hadn't started it, she knew she was responsible for what it carried out, partly because she was an insider, partly because she knew all too well the pain of those on the outside, those who lacked the position, reputation, or power to demand justice. And deep inside, a very real feeling was stirring in her chest. No one wants their life to become a public lesson, but sometimes it's necessary. Captain Reynolds, having received 3 consecutive calls from SkyJet headquarters, was beginning to feel pressure heavier than the weight of the Boeing 737 beneath his feet. He distanced himself from the passengers to let out a silent scream, something a veteran commander with 20 years of experience rarely did. He returned to the cabin, his face pensive. "Dr. Ellington, the communications department just contacted us. The news has leaked out. Naomi nodded, slightly unsurprised. I know. The media always moves faster than reason. Reynolds exhaled his hand unconsciously, clenching and then releasing. They wanted me to keep her safe and keep everyone calm. Naomi looked around the cabin where passengers were chatting, whispering, live streaming, and texting. Safe, she repeated the word in a voice as soft as mist. Captain, I'm not afraid of anyone here. Reynolds looked at her, and he understood. She wasn't afraid of the crowd. She was afraid of something else, the silence when injustice occurs. In row 2D, the black man, the first to stand up to defend Naomi, is looking at his phone with a frantic gaze. He turned to his wife beside him. Look, every news site is reporting it. The wife nodded, her voice trembling slightly. Someday, my daughter will read this story. He squeezed his wife's hand. And it will know that it is not silent. Those words reached Naomi's ears, not directly, but enough to touch her heart. She didn't turn around, but her hands clasped together slightly. A moment of silence, filled with emotion. While the cabin was in turmoil outside, social media exploded. Large accounts began sharing the story at Aviation Insider. A CEO was kicked off a plane owned by her own company. At Equity Watch, discrimination doesn't look at business cards. It looks at skin color first. At Black Women Lead Dr. Naomi Ellington, you are not alone. The whole world seemed to revolve around the plane that hadn't even taken off yet. Darren Holt, the flight manager who had contributed to the incident, was now standing in a corner of the cabin, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at Naomi, too afraid to say a word, but then, as if compelled by something, he took a step forward. Dr. Ellington, Naomi returned. Her gaze wasn't cold, nor did it put any additional pressure on him. She simply listened. Darren lowered his voice. I didn't know things would turn out like this. Naomi replied, her voice soft but firm. You don't need to know who I am to treat me kindly. A simple statement, but powerful enough to make Darren bow his head. Sometimes the right reminder only needs 6 words. Ann Madison. She stood a few seats away, barely daring to look up. Her phone in her pocket vibrated incessantly, probably a notification from work or a message from friends who had seen her name appear on the internet. She walked slowly, as if dragging the entire weight of a mistake. Dr. Ellington. Naomi turned her eyes, strangely peaceful. Madison swallowed hard, her voice cracking. I let prejudice guide me. I have no excuses. I apologize. Naomi looked at her for a long time. It wasn't a look of condemnation, nor one of immediate forgiveness. That's the perspective of someone who's been on both sides, the one who's been wrongly judged, and the one who examines their own mistakes. Thank you for telling the truth, Naomi replied. Madison blinked, perhaps not expecting such a gentle response. But Naomi continued, but an apology is just the beginning. Madison nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. I know. A moment of silence. Not a silence of discomfort, but a silence that allows the heart to realize what is right. Then, unexpectedly, like a communication lightning bolt, the airplane cabin erupted with the simultaneous ringing of alarm bells from many passengers. The woman in the 3rd row was breathing heavily. Oh my God, the White House posted it. Ethan shouted. What? The man in row 4 let out an unbelievable laugh. This is national news now. All eyes were on Naomi. She took a deep breath and smiled softly, a quiet, beautiful, and powerful smile. Then, we need to do it right. Naomi had no desire for this media frenzy, but she knew, when the truth came to light, her responsibility was to guide it in the right direction, not for punishment, not for revenge. But it's time for change. Captain Reynolds stood in front of the cabin, looked at everyone, and declared, We will continue the flight, but we will do so with mutual respect. Naomi nodded slightly. The whole cabin seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The flight hadn't even left the ground yet, but it had already taken on a story that none of them would ever forget. And out there, a media frenzy has begun to spiral into the heart of America. The cabin of SkyJet 382 gradually returned to a hazy stillness, but not the usual tranquility of a flight preparing for takeoff. This was a stillness carrying the aftershocks of a tremor, like a lake that has stopped shaking, but whose ripples continue to spread towards the shore. The cabin lights shifted to a warm yellow glow. Passengers settled back into their seats, but few truly relaxed. They all knew this flight was no longer simply a journey from Dallas to Seattle. It had become a witness to a confrontation between prejudice and truth, between power and responsibility. Dr. Naomi Ellington sat upright, her hand resting lightly on the armrest of her chair. Though her expression was calm, the lingering effects of recent events remained. Not trauma, a familiar feeling for a black woman growing up in the business world, but a heavy sense of responsibility, knowing that the task at hand was far greater than anticipated. She had to face it. But how would she choose to face it? That was the question silently echoing in Naomi's heart, even as the cabin returned to order. Up front, Captain Thomas Reynolds spoke to SkyJet headquarters over the radio. His voice was low and hoarse, clearly under immense pressure. "I'm conducting a requested inspection. Yes, I understand the level. No passengers posed a danger. This is a matter of procedure and service conduct." He paused. He looked at Naomi from a distance, his gaze a mixture of respect and guilt. "Yes, I will coordinate the next steps." He ended the call and put the walkie-talkie down. His hand trembled slightly. Madison Cole, the one who had caused the whole thing, stood motionless against the cabin wall. She was no longer angry, no longer defensive, no longer saying, "I was just doing my job." All that remained on her face was emptiness, like someone who had just seen their own reflection in a mirror and didn't recognize themselves. She wondered, why did she react that way? Why did a simply dressed black woman arouse such suspicion in her? Why didn't she investigate, before accusing, She knew the answer. She just didn't have the courage to admit it. A colleague gently placed a hand on her shoulder, but Madison recoiled. "I'm fine," but her eyes were red, her lips trembling slightly. No, she wasn't okay. Darren Holt, the flight manager, fared no better. He realized he had relied on authority instead of reason. He had trusted personal feelings instead of evidence. He had sided with the wrong party from the very beginning. He whispered to himself, "I've messed everything up." And inside, he felt as if the chair beneath his feet was slowly disappearing. In the back seats, the passengers' conversation began to take on a different tone. A middle-aged man said, "When she was treated like that, I thought, oh, another troublemaker. But now, I feel ashamed." A woman nodded. "We've become accustomed to trusting people in uniforms more than those who are silent," a young person added. "And sometimes, that's precisely the problem." A whisper spread through the cabin, not a lament of blame, but a lament of awakening. Naomi listened to it all from her seat. She heard the voices, the regrets, the belated realizations, but at the same time, she also heard the echoes of those who didn't have the same opportunity as her. Those who left the plane in silence. Those who chose to endure it because they didn't want to miss their flight. Those who were wronged and believed they didn't deserve it. And Naomi understood. This wasn't just for her. It was for all of them. Then Captain Reynolds approached Naomi. He bowed slightly, his voice sincere. "Dr. Ellington, management has asked me to inform you that the entire matter is under internal investigation. They want to know if you requested a flight suspension." The entire cabin fell silent. Naomi looked at him for longer than a breath. She understood what that question meant. If she wanted to, Madison could lose her job immediately. If she wanted to, Darren could be suspended. If she wanted to, SkyJet could publicly apologize to her on every platform. She was perfectly capable of doing it. But she asked herself, would that change the entire system, or would it just change a few names? Naomi squeezed his hand gently, then said something that sent shivers down many people's spines. "I don't want revenge." Reynolds nodded, trying to hide his relief. But Naomi didn't stop there. "I want accountability. I want the truth. I want them to understand why this hurts. And I want SkyJet to fix this for the next person, not just for me." Madison heard every word. She covered her mouth with her hand. Tears fell not because she'd been caught, but because she was confronting herself. Reynolds took a deep breath. "Dr. Ellington, what do you want us to do to correct this?" Naomi sat up straight, her eyes not angry but shining like torches in the night. "I want a meeting on this plane. Right now, with everyone involved." Everyone in the cabin looked up. A meeting. Right now. On the plane. In front of all the passengers, Reynolds blinked. "Right now." Naomi nodded slightly. "That's right, because everyone witnessed it. And I want everyone to understand that justice doesn't always come from the office. Sometimes, it begins in the very moment a mistake happens." A wave of silence rose. No one laughed. No one doubted. Because from Naomi's voice, they heard a rare truth. No one here is an audience. Everyone is a witness. Reynolds looked at Madison and Darren. Both of you come here. They walked slowly as if on fragile ground. Naomi turned her chair to face them. No defensiveness. No power struggles. Just one person speaking to two other people. Let's begin. Madison's voice trembled. I was wrong to judge you without checking, Naomi asked. What are you judging? Madison looked down, too scared to speak. But Naomi wouldn't let go of the truth. I'm asking seriously. You don't think I look like the kind of person who would sit here, do you? Madison bit her lip. Tears welled up. Correct. Naomi didn't scold. She didn't humiliate. She just said, thank you for telling the truth. Reynolds and Darren both looked up. They hadn't expected Naomi to steer the story in a direction that wasn't at all destructive. Naomi continued, her voice soft but poignant. We cannot fix something we dare not name. Darren took a deep breath. I was wrong, too. I prioritized speed over the truth. Naomi looked at him. Her gaze wasn't judgmental, but it was powerful enough that he would never forget it. Working quickly is not as important as doing it right. The passengers in the cabin were silent, but every word of their conversation seemed to fall straight into each person's mind, because each of them had once judged someone too quickly, once trusted a mistaken intuition, once unconsciously chosen to side with the uniform. And now they are witnessing a rare moment. Mistakes are called by name and confronted with the truth, not with violence. When the small meeting ended, Naomi whispered, but everyone heard her, we don't need to be perfect. We just need to dare to correct our mistakes. Inside the compartment, no one moved. The only sensation was as if everyone's heart had slowed down by a single beat. It's not because Naomi is the CEO. It's because she just did something that many leaders haven't done. Use power to heal, not to hurt. And at that very moment, the responsibility Naomi had to bear became clear. She doesn't just represent herself. She represents all those who have been silent. And now, she chooses to break that silence. The atmosphere on SkyJet Flight 382 after the brief meeting seemed to fall into a state of holding its breath. Everything was so quiet that Naomi could clearly hear the gentle whirring of the fans running along the cabin ceiling, like the steady breathing of a giant creature trying to remain calm after being awakened. Captain Thomas Reynolds returned to the cockpit. His expression involuntarily made many passengers feel uneasy. It was the expression of someone who knew that what had just happened was only the first thin layer of a much larger iceberg. As he closed the cockpit door, the sound of metal lightly tapping against the frame was clearly audible, and less than 3 seconds later the intercom in the cockpit rang, a signal reserved only for high-level calls. Reynolds glanced at the small screen. Incoming call, SkyJet headquarters, executive line. His heart skipped a beat. This isn't a health hotline. This is a hotline that only rings when the company realizes they're facing a real crisis. He pressed the button to answer the call. Reynolds speaking. The voice from the other end of the line was deep, cold, and decisive. Captain Reynolds, this is Jordan Keaton, Chief Operating Officer of SkyJet Airlines. The COO called directly. On a flight awaiting crisis management. This had never happened in his 17 years as a pilot. Reynolds stood up straighter, as if his position in the cabin had suddenly become too small to contain the pressure. Yes, I'm listening. Keaton gets straight to the point. We've reviewed the video, recorded by passengers and social pulse reports, that the incident is spreading at a rate of 320% every 10 minutes. Reynolds swallowed hard. We need to know, Keaton continued, is the current situation under control? Is the passenger involved, Dr. Naomi Ellington, currently? All right. Reynolds looked through the partition towards Naomi. She sat quietly, her hands clasped together, not causing a scene, not crying, not getting angry, just quiet. A silence can make all the mistakes of others seem louder. She's calm, he replied, but this is not something to be taken lightly. The person on the other end of the line paused for a few seconds. We know. That silence was as heavy as lead. Keaton continued, Captain, tell me exactly how far have things gone in the cabin? Reynolds took a deep breath, then answered truthfully, something he had to do both as a pilot and as a person. Most passengers witnessed the blatant discrimination. They filmed it all. And, Dr. Ellington is a very influential person. She's not an ordinary passenger, Keaton said in a low voice. We know who she is. Reynolds frowned. You know, I know. A sigh echoed through the phone. She's the CEO of Ellington Aerotech, the company that supplies maintenance parts for 4 of SkyJet's aircraft models. Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. Ellington Aerotech, one of our most important strategic partners. A name that commands respect from anyone in the aviation industry. And, Keaton continued, she is also a major investor in the 3 funds that SkyJet relies on to operate its ground infrastructure. Reynolds closed his eyes, just for a moment. But it was enough to feel how serious the situation was. Captain Keaton said, his voice now lower, this is a systemic crisis. We're asking you to keep Dr. Ellington calm while being prepared to work directly with her. Reynolds opened his eyes and asked softly, You want me to apologize on behalf of the company? Keaton replied bluntly, No. We want you to ask her how she wants the company to rectify the situation. And record it verbatim. Reynolds could hardly believe his ears. This is no longer about handling passenger issues. This is about negotiating with a senior shareholder right in the cabin. Meanwhile, in the passenger compartment, Naomi remained seated calmly, but her mind was anything but at peace. She felt her phone vibrate gently in her pocket. A call from Evan Blake, chairman of the board of Ellington Aerotech, her close advisor. Naomi stared at the screen for a long time. She knew Evan would ask her to leave the flight. She knew he would say that her reputation was more important than self-reproach. But Naomi didn't press the answer button. She just let the phone continue to vibrate, and then stop. In that moment, she wondered, if I leave now, what will those who stand up for me think? What will those who have suffered similar injustices think? That struggle wasn't noisy. It was silent, and it was precisely that silence that made it deeper. In the back seat, passenger Ethan Parker, the first person to live stream, was looking at Naomi with a mixed expression of regret and admiration. He said to himself, if I could go back to the beginning, my videos would have hurt her before I knew the truth. He didn't turn off the live stream, but this time he held the phone lower, no longer pointing it directly at Naomi. One viewer commented, Do you regret recording now? Ethan whispered, almost just loud enough for himself to hear, I regret the way I thought. The cockpit door swung open slightly. Captain Reynolds stepped out, his face as tense as a taut string. He approached Naomi's chair and said softly, Dr. Ellington, SkyJet headquarters wants to speak with you in person. Everyone in the cabin turned to look. It wasn't out of curiosity. It was because everyone understood it was unprecedented for an airline to call passengers directly while they were waiting for takeoff. Naomi blinked slightly, not out of surprise, but to regain her focus. Okay, she said, softly, but enough to make Reynolds feel the weight of those 2 words. He gave her the company phone. Naomi placed it on her palm, gazing at it for a few seconds as if feeling the coldness of the metal. Then she put the phone to her ear. It's Dr. Naomi Ellington. Keaton's voice rang out, Dr. Ellington, on behalf of the entire SkyJet leadership team. I offer our deepest apologies. In the cabin, everyone sitting nearby could hear because Keaton was speaking louder than usual, as if he wanted all the witnesses to clearly hear that SkyJet was facing the truth. Naomi didn't say anything right away. She let 3 seconds pass. 3 seconds was enough to make the entire flight hold its breath. Finally, she replied, I don't need an apology anytime soon. I need lasting change. Keaton exhaled very softly. We understand, and we are ready to adjust any policies you request. Naomi looked out the window where the midday light shone on the streaks of wings reflecting off the light. And then she said something that made the whole cabin seem to stop moving. I want the entire crew involved to be removed from this flight immediately, so that an independent investigation can begin. Madison heard those words. Her hands dropped, her heart heavy. She knew this was the consequence. And she knew. Naomi wasn't saying it out of anger. She was saying it out of responsibility. Naomi continued, I want them to receive proper retraining, not blind punishment. That sentence made Madison burst into silent tears. And then, a gentle but profound twist, Naomi continued. And I would like to speak directly with the CEO of SkyJet within the next 24 hours. The entire cabin was completely silent. Keaton only had time to reply, I will arrange it immediately. The call has ended. Naomi returned the phone to Reynolds. He looked at her with respect. Thank you for choosing this path. Naomi smiled very slightly. It wasn't my choice. Circumstances forced me to stand up. I was just doing what was right. Reynolds nodded. A nod that spoke not only of himself but of all those who were relearning about respect. Immediately afterward, the cabin radio lit up. Security team requested at gate C-18. Crew reassignment required. Madison and Darren understood. They would have to get off the flight now. But there was something nobody expected. As Madison walked past Naomi, Naomi gently placed a hand on her arm. She spoke very softly, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "Fix yourself before you try to fix others." Madison burst into tears, nodding her head tremblingly. She had never received such advice before, not even when she was at the depths of despair. When security arrived and escorted the offending flight attendants off the flight, many passengers silently stood up and made way for them. Not for mockery, not for filming, but let them leave with some dignity. It was clear Naomi hadn't chosen to destroy them. She was teaching them and SkyJet a much bigger lesson. When the cabin door closed again, Naomi leaned back in her seat and gently closed her eyes. It wasn't because she was tired. It was because she knew a major chapter in her life had just begun. The cabin gradually quieted down after the old flight attendants left the cockpit, but the atmosphere wasn't the usual calm before takeoff. It was like the brief pause after a major clap of thunder. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt the aftershock spreading in multiple directions simultaneously. And in that silence, social media began to explode. Passenger Ethan Parker's phone lit up incessantly. Notifications poured down on his screen like a waterfall. 650 new comments, 127 private messages, 47 tags attached to posts. He looked at the numbers in disbelief. Just minutes before, he was just an ordinary businessman on a delayed flight. Now his video has surpassed 300,000 views and is growing every second. One notable comment: "This is the most shocking discrimination case I've seen this year." Another line: "Is that really Dr. Naomi Ellington, the CEO?" The investor Ethan swallowed hard. He never imagined that a video lasting just a few dozen seconds could completely transform the image of an airline like that. And I never thought I would contribute to creating such a huge wave. Meanwhile, Naomi remained silent. She gazed out the window where the Texas sky was bathed in a pale yellow sunlight, like the faint light before an impending media storm. She wasn't happy, not gloating, not angry. She was just thinking. Think about those who have gone through similar experiences, but there were no cameras recording, no CEO calling them, no COO apologizing, no one treating them as a complete human being. She gently squeezed her fingers together as if to keep herself steady amidst the flood of information pouring in from all directions. A few rows behind them, 3 young passengers whispered to each other, but their voices were loud enough to be overheard. "Hey, look at video number 2, the scene where she asks for a system change." There's also the video of Captain making a phone call to the company. People are sharing it like crazy. SkyJet is being dragged into the storm. An elderly man interjected into the conversation, his voice hoarse but sincere, but I found her strangely calm, as if she had been preparing for this unfair world for a long time. A middle-aged woman nodded, and it was that very calmness that made everything resonate even more strongly. Sitting in the seat near the door, Officer Samuel Boyd, the one who had first approached Naomi, was staring intently at his phone. The airport security unit issued an internal alert: no intervention. The passenger involved has a special position, temporarily removed from the fault assessment process. He sighed. He wasn't afraid of being disciplined. He only feared one thing. If Naomi hadn't spoken up, if the video hadn't been posted, would he have continued to unconsciously follow the procedure and ignore the truth once again? He had been doing this job for many years, and for Dewis. The first time in his career he felt a sense of awakening. While the cabin was filled with thoughts and the clicking of keyboards outside where social media was operating at lightning speed, dozens of posts began spreading uncontrollably. A featured tweet from an aviation expert: "If SkyJet doesn't handle this properly, they could lose a maintenance contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Don't mess with this woman's power." A post from a women's and people of color rights advocacy group. This isn't just Naomi Ellington's story. This is the story of millions of people who are not respected in the spaces they paid to belong to. Another TikTok viral hit. In the video, Ethan's voice trembles slightly as he reads the comments. "Guys, I was there right when it all happened. And now I understand the real issue wasn't the seats. It was the look people gave her from the very first second. A few seconds after the video started, the number of comments exceeded 30000. Captain Reynolds returned to the cabin. His face was serious, but his eyes softened when he looked at Naomi. He spoke softly, just loud enough for the front row to hear. Dr. Ellington, we're becoming the focus of social media. Over 40 news outlets have approached SkyJet for comment. Naomi remained calm. I knew it would come, Reynolds said softly. Would you like to turn off the internet on the flight? Several passengers immediately looked up. Some even feared that Naomi would ask for it. But Naomi just shook her head. No. If the truth must be seen, let it come to pass. The words pierced the silence of the cabin like an arrow. Someone whispered, I've never seen anyone so calm. At that moment, Naomi's phone lit up again. Not a phone call. A series of email notifications from her office. Subject urgent. Requests from CNBC, CNN, Fox Business, Bloomberg. Subject viral content alert. Your name trending #1 inch U.S. Subject staff requesting statement. Naomi stared at the screen for a few seconds. There was no panic in her eyes. Only a slight weariness and an acceptance that her role was no longer just that of an insulted passenger. She is the one who must speak up, not for power but for responsibility. Passenger 3B, the young woman who had witnessed everything from the beginning, turned to the person next to her. Do you think this will change SkyJet? The other person replied. It's not just SkyJet. I think the airline industry needs to reconsider how they treat passengers. The girl smiled absent-mindedly. And strangely enough, it all started with a woman being told she didn't look like the person sitting here. Online news channels began running headlines like this. A black CEO faced discrimination on a partner airline's plane. SkyJet is facing its biggest crisis in 10 years. Naomi Ellington, the woman who shook up the aviation industry. The hashtag number Stand with Naomi shot to #1 inch the United States. Ethan Parker, who was still live streaming, suddenly stopped talking. He looked up and saw Naomi, looking in his direction. Don't be reckless. Don't blame. It was just the look of someone who understood he was wrong, but also understood that he was trying to correct his mistake. Ethan gripped the phone tightly, then spoke into the live stream in his real voice. I want everyone to know, Naomi Ellington wasn't the troublemaker. She was the last person to want to make a big deal out of it. But the truth can't be kept silent forever. At that moment, millions of live stream viewers paused for a few seconds. The following comments appeared. Thank you for speaking the truth. I respect the way she handled things. This is why change must begin with those who dare to stand up. Up ahead, Captain Reynolds receives a new message from headquarters. Keep Dr. Ellington stable. We will attend to all her requests. Social Pulse is currently on red alert. Reynolds Quay sang Naomi. Everyone out there is waiting for you to say something. Naomi leaned back in her chair, staring blankly into space. She thought for a long time. Then she spoke slowly, as if each word carried the weight of hundreds of insults she had endured. I'm not saying anything right now. Reynolds was slightly surprised. Not saying anything. Naomi shook her head. No. I want the world to see the story for themselves. When the emotions have calmed down, I will speak out. Reynolds nodded. A respectful nod. And so, as social media exploded out there, as millions debated what they had just seen as SkyJet faced the greatest pressure in its history, Naomi chose to remain silent, a silence that made the whole world listen. While SkyJet Flight 382 was still awaiting processing under the bright sunshine of Dallas Airport, hundreds of miles away at SkyJet Airlines headquarters in Denver, another storm was brewing. The conference room on the 24th floor, usually only used for discussing quarterly plans, revenue, or expansion strategies, has now become a crisis center. Every screen in the room displays hashtags, viral statistics, and graphs showing the growth of negative sentiment. Number: Stand with Naomi. Number: SkyJet discrimination. Number: Ellington truth. No one spoke loudly. Even as they faced the risk of hundreds of millions of dollars in losses, the room was shrouded in a peculiar kind of silence, the silence of people who knew they had taken the matter too lightly for too long. On the flight, Naomi didn't know, or perhaps knew, but didn't care that SkyJet was sliding into its biggest defensive position since the 2016 data breach. She sat silently, gazing at the folding table in front of her chair. her fingers lightly touching the cold metal curve. Perhaps it was that very coolness that helped her maintain her composure amidst the whirlwind of media attention raging outside. The surrounding passengers continued to whisper, but there was no longer judgment. They spoke in the voices of those who had seen the truth. I hope SkyJet handles this properly. If they ignore it, they will lose a lot of customers. It's not just about the customers, it's about trust. Naomi heard it, but she didn't react. She knew everyone was waiting for her to say something, but she maintained a deliberate silence. Silence, sometimes, is the most powerful voice. In Denver, in the middle of the conference room, COO Jordan Keaton stood in front of the screen, hands clasped together, his eyes as sharp as tempered glass. How are things going? A data analyst flips through a stack of documents. The original video has now surpassed 2.4 million views. The event is trending at #1 across the United States. A female PR manager added, "We've received over 380 interview requests from the press. 6 major news outlets are requesting official comment." The chief operating officer sighed. "And what about the shareholder reaction?" The finance officer nodded slightly. "Yes, that's right. Many people are requesting emergency meetings. Some funds are starting to reassess their investments." Everyone looked at each other in fear. But what stunned the entire meeting room was the next statement, and the Ellington Aerotech team requested an urgent meeting. They want the SkyJet CEO to be present. One employee whispered, "Oh my God." No further explanation is needed. If Ellington Aerotech, Naomi's own company, is calling an emergency meeting, it means they're not just treating this as an internal matter. They view this as a systemic problem. This issue needs to be addressed at the highest level. In the cabin, Captain Reynolds received another call. When he heard the content, his face froze for a moment. He approached Naomi's chair and leaned slightly forward. "Dr. Ellington, SkyJet headquarters wants to transfer all matters related to this incident to senior management. They said, the SkyJet CEO personally wants to hear your opinion." The surrounding passengers couldn't help but look up. An old woman placed her hand over her chest as if she had just witnessed something important. They had no other choice. They had to face it. Naomi still kept her voice soft. "I get it." But her eyes were deeper than before. Not coldness, but the heaviness of responsibility. At the same time, in the SkyJet conference room, CEO Landon Pierce, who usually avoids crisis meetings, walked in. He had the demeanor of someone who knew that both light and shadow were shining directly upon him. He placed both hands on the table, looking directly at the team. "Tell me the whole truth." Keaton details everything: Madison's behavior, the confrontation, the cabin meeting, the social media overview, and the pressure from shareholders. When Keaton mentioned that Naomi had requested retraining instead of immediate dismissal, the meeting room fell silent. CEO Pierce frowned. "She doesn't want revenge." Keaton shook his head. "No, she wants to change." Pierce pondered. To say something like that after being humiliated. "We're dealing with a type of leadership no company wants to be rivals to," a PR director said with a trembling voice. "If she chooses to publicly criticize SkyJet, our reputation will be ruined in a matter of hours." Pierce crossed his arms. "We cannot let this be defined by wrongdoing. We must let it be defined by how we correct it." He looked at the whole team, his voice low but weighty. "Prepare for a direct conversation with Dr. Ellington. No defensiveness, no blame, no hiding anything." He paused for a moment, "and there really has to be change. From the root." Back on the plane, Naomi gently placed her phone on the table after receiving an email about the official meeting. No one but she could see it, but Naomi's face revealed a layer of emotion no one could have predicted. Tired, but not giving up. Pressure, but no trembling. Fight, but don't hate. They say strength comes from a loud voice, but for Naomi, strength comes from quiet steadfastness. Ethan Parker, still watching everything, turned to the person next to him. "I think she doesn't just want to win," the other person asked. "So what does she want?" Ethan looked at Naomi, his voice slowing down. "She wants to make this world a better place. A small truth. But it resonates strongly." In Denver, the meeting was becoming increasingly tense. CEO Pierce stood in front of a large glass window overlooking the city below, which was gradually fading into the twilight. He said, "I watched the video of Dr. Ellington talking about long-term change. She didn't belittle anyone. She didn't humiliate our employees. She didn't abuse her power." He turned around, his eyes lighting up. That's the kind of person we have to listen to, not confront. A human resources manager asked, "How do you intend to respond?" Pierce didn't hesitate. "No closed-door meetings. No scripts. I'll meet her in person." Keaton was a little worried. "Are you sure? This will be big news," Pierce replied calmly. "The truth is always the biggest news." At the same time, back in the cabin, Naomi received a text message from her assistant. "Board meeting rescheduled. Press waiting. Employees waiting for your guidance." Naomi closed her phone. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she needed a few seconds to catch her breath amidst the pressure mounting from both the company and the entire airline industry. She slowly closed her eyes. A scene flashed through her mind the first day she was rejected from aerodynamics school because the professor said, "Black girls aren't suited for this field." Naomi was 18 then, and she proved him wrong with her life afterward. She opened her eyes. No more trembling. No more heaviness. There is only one truth left. She has to stand up, not just for herself, but for those who will be treated like her if the system doesn't change. In Denver, Pierce said the following to conclude the meeting: "We cannot choose the past, but we can choose how to rewrite the future. And the future of SkyJet will be written starting with this dialogue with Naomi Ellington." The whole conference room was silent. They didn't know what effect the meeting would have, but they knew one thing. This isn't just about crisis management. This is about rebuilding trust, a belief that has been broken, not in a day, but over years. On the plane, Naomi just sat silently watching the last rays of the afternoon sun shine on the cabin floor. She had no idea what was being decided hundreds of miles away, but she knew very well that this story was bigger than a slap in the face, bigger than a first-class seat. This is a story about justice, about respect, about asking for a better world without shouting. This is her story, but it's everyone's story too. And the next chapter, the whole world is waiting. The Texas sky began to turn, a soft purple, as the sun sank below the horizon. Through the small window next to seat 2, Naomi watched the last rays of sunlight fade across the vast landscape. A thin, gentle layer of light enveloped the plane like a warm blanket at the end of the day. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained as tense as a taut string that no one dared to touch. Captain Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit, holding the company phone, his face serious but his eyes filled with respect. He stopped in front of Naomi's chair and bowed slightly. "Dr. Ellington, SkyJet headquarters is ready to speak with you in person." Nearby passengers instinctively looked up. No one spoke, but the silence held a shared question. Now, where will everything go? Naomi took a deep breath, her hand gently smoothing the hem of her dress. She didn't need much preparation for this story. She had been preparing her whole life. She nodded. "I'm ready." Reynolds handed her the phone as if it were a sacred object. Naomi held the phone to her ear. The screen displayed the following text: "Landon Pierce, CEO, SkyJet Airlines." That moment seemed to slow down, not because of fear, but because she understood this call would not only change the flight path of Flight SK-382, but possibly the entire direction of an airline. Then a deep, clear, and calm male voice rang out, "Dr. Ellington." "I'm Landon Pierce," Naomi replied softly but firmly. "Hello, Mr. Pierce." A brief silence, enough for two heavy hearts to prepare for a dialogue that everyone understood to be historical. Pierce began. "First and foremost, I would like to offer you my deepest apologies on behalf of SkyJet. No excuses are sufficient. No circumstances justify it. We were wrong." Naomi listened to every word, every breath in that apology. This isn't the smooth, polished apology of a PR department. It's the voice of someone admitting their mistake before anyone forces them to. She replied, "I acknowledge your apology." She paused, then continued, "But this problem doesn't just stop with me." Pierce breathed slowly. "I know, and that's why I want to hear from you in person." Naomi watched the last rays of sunlight outside, her voice deep but not harsh. "Mr. Pierce, I don't want to punish anyone. I want to change the system that made this happen." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The passengers couldn't hear the content of the call clearly, but they could tell from Naomi's expression that the situation was escalating to a much larger scale. Pierce said, "We are prepared to adjust any policies as needed." Naomi tilted her head, her gaze directed out the window. The sky had turned a deeper purple. "This isn't just a policy on paper. I want real change." Pierce was silent for a few seconds. Then his voice lowered. "Tell me, Naomi, what do you want SkyJet to do?" The way he addressed her gently without title was a sign of sincerity. Naomi turned around, her eyes fixed on the folding table in front of the chair, as if resting the entire weight of the decision she was about to make upon it. "I want 3 things." Reynolds was standing nearby, and although the cabin couldn't hear clearly, everyone could sense the tension rising. Naomi began. 1. Mandatory retraining for all customer-facing staff. Her voice was clear. No online courses, no tick to complete. I want a real program with real scenarios, real feedback, and a real instructor. Pierce replied, "We will rebuild from scratch." 2. An independent committee has the authority to examine any discrimination complaint. Naomi said, "Employees cannot be left to judge their own behavior. There needs to be a mechanism for passengers to trust." Pierce, "You'll have it." 3. A commitment to transparency. SkyJet publicly discloses complaint data and progress on improvements, Naomi asserted. Without transparency, no change will be real. On the other end of the line, Pierce let out a heavy sigh as if he realized the request would send shockwaves through the entire industry. But then he said, "Okay, a single word but also the biggest promise a CEO can make." Naomi leaned back in her chair, not out of relief, but out of acceptance of the long journey ahead. Pierce continued, "Is there anything else you would like to ask for?" Naomi closed her eyes for a second, just one. Then she spoke slowly, steadily, and with full humanity. "Let Madison and Darren be retrained instead of firing them immediately." Everyone in the cabin looked at Naomi. Even though they couldn't hear the words, they sensed her kindness. Pierce was completely silent for 5 seconds. Then he said, "You really don't want to fire them," Naomi replied. "If they learn something from this mistake, then society will be a little better, and that's more important than punishment." A woman in row 3B raised her hand to her mouth, visibly moved. Reynolds looked at Naomi with genuine respect. On the other end of the line, Pierce said, "I understand why she is so respected." Naomi said nothing more. She didn't need compliments. The call continued for a few more minutes. Discussion, confirmation, commitment. Then Pierce said the closing words. "Naomi, when this flight lands, I want to meet you in person." Naomi replied, "I will come." The call has ended. Reynolds took the phone back, his voice low. She just changed the direction of an entire airline. Naomi shook her head slightly. "Not me, Captain. It's us, all of us, who saw the truth today." He nodded. A nod of gratitude that he couldn't express in words. After the call, the cabin fell into an eerie silence. No tension, no fear, no confusion. Rather, it was a kind of silence, like the moment when everyone witnesses something important happening together. A passenger whispered, "I just witnessed history. Right here on this flight." The other person replied, "I think. From now on, I will treat others better." Naomi heard it, and for the first time since boarding the plane, she genuinely smiled. It wasn't because she won. It was because she saw hope. A hope she had spent her whole life searching for in university, in boardrooms, on flights, and in silent, unseen struggles. Hopefully, change, even a small one, can begin with one person standing up for what is right. Outside the window, darkness had fallen. The airplane lights switched on, casting a warm glow into the cabin, inviting another chapter to begin. Naomi took a deep breath. The road ahead will be long. She knows that, but she was willing. Because sometimes, justice doesn't begin in court or in contracts or in press statements. Justice begins with someone who dares to speak up, do it right, and today that person is Naomi. The Seattle sky that night was covered in a light mist. As SkyJet 382 landed on the runway, the cool yellow lights reflected off the aircraft's fuselage, like long streaks of light marking a turbulent journey. As the landing gear touched down, the cabin vibrated slightly. But that vibration wasn't simply the movement of metal. It was like a soft sigh, the sigh of nearly 100 people who had just experienced an event they knew they would remember for a long time. "Doctor." Naomi Ellington opened her eyes. She looked out the window at the approaching ground service vehicles. No one knew what Naomi's true feelings were at that moment. Relief, exhaustion, or a quiet kind of courage of someone who had just stood up against a large system. But one thing is very clear. She was no longer the woman who had been insulted in first class. She was the woman who had changed the course of an airline and of many people. When the plane came to a complete stop, Captain Reynolds opened the cockpit door. He stepped out, adjusted his hat, and stood before the cabin like someone wanting to say their final words before concluding a major chapter. He looked at Naomi with an expression of respect. Dr. Ellington, thank you, not just for today, but for the way you chose to face everything. Naomi stood up and nodded slightly. I only do what I think is right. Reynolds replied. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't easy at all, an elderly passenger whispered. She made me look at myself in the mirror. A young man nodded. Me too. I think we've all learned something. No one applauded. No one cheered. No need. Those eyes full of contemplation, full of understanding, are the truest form of praise. As the plane door opened, a cool Seattle night breeze rushed in, carrying a faint scent of rain, a smell that only appears after sunset in the American Northwest. Naomi stepped out of the first cabin as requested by SkyJet. But what made her stop halfway up the stairs wasn't the request, but the sight below. Dozens of SkyJet employees stood in 2 long rows. No one said a word, but they all took off their hats, placed their hands in front of their stomachs, and bowed their heads. This is the most formal form of tribute that the aviation industry usually reserves for those who have sacrificed their lives in the line of duty, and today they dedicate it to Naomi, not because of her power, but because of her kindness. Pierce wasn't there, he was waiting in the main conference room, but the message was clear. We owe you an apology and a promise. Naomi bowed slightly in response. That small gesture made some of the staff members envious. Ethan Parker was waiting in the reception area. He wasn't live streaming anymore. His phone was neatly tucked away in his pocket. When Naomi approached, Ethan stepped closer without raising his camera, without saying anything ostentatious. He just said, I'm sorry for what I thought of you in those first few minutes. Naomi looked at him gently, without judgment. Thank you for being honest. And thank you for correcting yourself. Ethan nodded, his eyes stinging slightly. I think today will change my life. Naomi placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, What matters isn't where you went wrong, but who you choose to become after that mistake. Ethan bowed. His head moved. Those weren't the words of a victim, but of a guide. In SkyJet's conference room, CEO Landon Pierce was waiting. When Naomi entered, he stood straight, placing both hands on the table. No cameras, no media, no spotlights. There were only 2 people. A leader, a person who had been wronged. And between them is an opportunity to rewrite the rules of an industry. Pierce spoke, his weariness not concealed. Naomi. I'm sorry, Naomi replied. An apology is a beginning, not an end. Pierce nodded. He had prepared for this. I want to ask you one last thing. Why didn't you choose to make a big deal out of it? You could have easily brought SkyJet to its knees. Naomi looked at him, her eyes gentle but strong. Because I don't want to make anyone kneel. I want people to stand up the right way. Pierce was silent. There are words that make the listener feel as if they are being scrutinized right to the heart. Naomi continued. I don't fight because I'm offended. I fight for those who can't. Mr. Pierce placed his hand on his chest, a gesture as if to calm his heart in the face of the gentle power of those words. He said, We will do whatever you ask, and more. Naomi nodded. I don't need SkyJet to be perfect. I need SkyJet to be an example. Pierce stared at the table for a long time, then said, She gave us an opportunity to become better people. I promise I won't waste it. As Naomi left SkyJet headquarters, a light Seattle night rain began to fall. The raindrops, thin and delicate, landed on her coat like punctuation marks after a long, heavy but beautiful chapter. She paused in front of the large glass window, looking at her reflection, not a powerful CEO, not a victim of discrimination, but it was a black woman who stood up with silence, with truth, and with kindness. Behind her, SkyJet staff quietly watched her leave, as if looking at a living symbol of hope. On the way back to the hotel, Naomi looked at Seattle through the car window. The city lights reflected like soft streaks of light, like the light she had clung to her whole life, the light of steadfastness, of faith, of a future that listens. She thought of her mother, of the days when she was told, You don't belong there, of the meeting rooms where she was belittled before she could even speak, of the times she chose to remain silent because she was tired. And today, she feels proud that she didn't remain silent any longer, not through shouting, but through a calmness that makes the whole world stop and listen. When Naomi arrived at the hotel, she opened the door to her room, the scent of new wood, the warm yellow lighting, the quiet atmosphere. She put her bag down on the chair, then sat by the window watching the rain fall. The phone call from Ellington Aerotech appeared. Board members waiting for your debrief. But Naomi wasn't in a hurry. She gave herself a few minutes. A few minutes to breathe, to reconnect with herself, not as a CEO, not as an icon. It's just Naomi. A person still learning how to heal the world, a little bit each day. Before turning off the lights, she opened her phone to reread the messages from the stranger. Thank you for standing up. I've been through that. Your story has made me stronger. You've made me believe that kindness still has a place in this world. Naomi placed her hand on her chest and smiled softly. Perhaps this was my intention. And before the screen went dark, she opened her YouTube studio, a small channel where she shares stories about life experiences, about what's right, about how to stand up for yourself without hurting anyone. She breathed softly. Then he spoke into the camera as if talking to a friend. If you're watching this, remember that you are valuable. You deserve respect in any seat. She paused for a moment, her eyes shining with warmth. If you've ever been through something similar, don't stay silent. And if you witness it happening to someone else, stand by them. A gentle smile appeared. Thank you for watching this far. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. You never know, even a small action can make a big difference. She turned off the machine. The only sound in the room was the falling rain. But in Naomi's heart, and in the hearts of those who watched this story, something was healed. Something has begun. Something beautiful.